The rope sang through the air like a mockingbird's call, and Hannah Zimmerman's lasso landed perfectly around the neck of the bolting mustang before any man on the Outpost Ranch could even blink. She pulled the line taut with practiced ease, her leather gloves gripping the hemp as she dug her boots into the Nevada dust, bringing 1,500 pounds of wild horse to a surprised standstill while the ranch hands stood slack-jawed in the June heat of 1883. Xavier O'Malley had seen plenty of riders in his 32 years, most of them born in the saddle and raised on beef and bravado. But the woman standing in his corral with dirt on her split skirt and determination in her green eyes made every single one of them look like Sunday school children playing dress-up. The mustang snorted and pawed the ground, but Hannah held firm, speaking low and steady to the animal until its ears flicked forward and its muscles began to relax under her confident control. "Who the hell is that?" Xavier asked his foreman, a grizzled man named Dutch who had been working the Outpost Ranch since before Xavier's father died and left him this sprawling piece of Nevada territory just outside El Dorado Canyon. "That's the Zimmerman girl," Dutch said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Been camping up near the canyon for the past week. Heard she was looking for work, but I figured she meant cooking or mending. Nobody told me she could rope like that." Xavier watched as Hannah released the tension on the line gradually, letting the mustang understand that cooperation meant comfort. She moved closer to the animal with small, non-threatening steps, still talking in that low voice he could not quite hear from where he stood by the fence. The mustang tossed its head once, twice, then stood still as she reached up and ran her hand along its nose. 3 of his best hands had been trying to catch that particular horse for 2 days, and she had done it in less than 5 minutes. "Go ask her to come to the house," Xavier said, already walking away from the corral. "Tell her I want to talk about employment." Hannah Zimmerman had not expected much when she rode into the Outpost Ranch territory. She had been traveling alone since leaving her father's failing homestead in Colorado 3 months prior, taking odd jobs where she could find them and sleeping under the stars more nights than not. Her father had taught her everything he knew about horses and cattle before the consumption took him last winter, and her mother had died bringing her into the world 23 years ago. So there was nobody left to tell her that a woman had no business doing a man's work. She only knew that she was good with animals, better than most people she had met, and that she needed money if she was going to survive. The ranch house sat on a rise overlooking the sprawling valley that fed into El Dorado Canyon, where the Colorado River cut through red rock walls and created a passage that had drawn prospectors and ranchers alike to this harsh, beautiful country. The house itself was built from local timber and stone, 2 stories with a wide porch that provided shade during the brutal summer months. Hannah wiped her boots on the scraper outside and knocked on the door frame, since the door stood open to catch any breeze that might wander through. Xavier O'Malley appeared from inside, taller than she had realized from a distance, with dark hair that needed cutting and blue eyes that studied her with an intensity that made her straighten her spine. He wore his work clothes, denim and cotton stained with honest sweat, and there was nothing soft about him except perhaps the way he gestured for her to come inside rather than making her state her business on the porch like a beggar. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, and his voice carried the hint of an Irish lilt that his father must have brought over from the old country. "Dutch tells me you are looking for work." "I am," Hannah said, meeting his gaze directly. Her father had taught her that too, that looking away made people think you had something to hide. "I can work horses, cattle, mend fence, break colts, and I am not afraid of long hours or hard conditions." "I saw what you did with that mustang," Xavier said, leaning against the doorframe of what looked like his office. "That animal has been running circles around my men for 2 days. You made it look easy." "It was not easy," Hannah corrected him. "It just requires patience and understanding what the horse wants. Most people try to dominate an animal through force. I prefer to convince them that cooperation is in their best interest." Something shifted in Xavier's expression, a flash of amusement or perhaps respect. "You have a place to stay?" he asked. "I have been camping up by the canyon," Hannah said. "I have my own gear and my horse. I do not require much." "The bunkhouse is full up with the regular hands," Xavier said, seeming to think out loud. "But there is a small cabin about a quarter-mile from here, near the creek. Previous owner used it for storage, but it has a good roof and a fireplace. You are welcome to it if you work for me." Hannah felt her heart kick up its pace, hope flaring in her chest like a match struck in darkness. "What would the wage be?" she asked, keeping her voice level. Xavier studied her for a long moment, and Hannah got the distinct impression he was calculating not just what she was worth, but what it would take to keep her from riding on to the next ranch or the next town. "Standard hand makes $30 a month plus meals," he said finally. "But you are not a standard hand, are you?" "No, sir, I am not," Hannah said firmly. "Name your wage and stay," Xavier said, the words coming out like a challenge and an invitation all at once. "Tell me what you think you are worth, and if I agree, the job is yours." Hannah had never been asked such a question in her life. Every other place she had worked, she had been told what she would receive and expected to be grateful for it. She thought about the skill it had taken her years to develop, the knowledge her father had passed down, the fact that she had just accomplished in minutes what Xavier's crew could not do in days. She thought about what she would need to save if she ever wanted to buy her own piece of land, modest as it might be. $45 a month plus meals and the cabin, she said, watching his face for a reaction. "And I want it understood that I am to be treated like any other hand. I will not tolerate disrespect or harassment from the men, and I expect to be judged solely on the quality of my work." Xavier pushed away from the doorframe and extended his hand. "You have a deal, Miss Zimmerman. Welcome to the Outpost Ranch." His hand was calloused and warm when she shook it, and Hannah felt the solid grip of someone who kept his word. She had gambled on her own worth and won, and the satisfaction of that moment carried her through the rest of the day as she moved her camp down to the cabin Xavier had promised. The cabin was better than she had expected, sturdy and weathertight with a stone fireplace that drew properly and a window that looked out toward the canyon. Someone had left a rope bed frame inside, and Hannah had her own bedroll to put on it. She spent the evening sweeping out dust and mouse droppings, checking for scorpions in the corners, and arranging her few possessions in a way that made the space feel like it might become home. Her horse, a steady buckskin gelding named Copper, seemed content in the small corral attached to the cabin, and as the sun set over the Nevada mountains, Hannah sat on the cabin steps and allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in months: security. Work on the Outpost Ranch began before dawn and did not end until the light failed. Hannah rose with the stars still bright overhead and made her way to the main corral where the hands gathered for their assignments. Dutch gave out the day's tasks with the efficiency of a man who had been doing this for decades, and Hannah noticed that he did not single her out or treat her differently than anyone else. She was assigned to ride fence line in the south pasture with 2 other hands, checking for breaks and marking spots that would need repair. The men she rode with were cautious at first, testing her with silence and sideways glances, but Hannah had expected that. She did her work without complaint, spotting fence damage they had missed and helping to drag a dead juniper tree out of a wash that would flood come the fall rains. By midday, when they stopped to water the horses and eat the biscuits and jerky they had packed, one of the men, a young hand named Martin with sunburned cheeks and a quick smile, started asking her questions about where she had learned to rope. "My father," Hannah said simply. "He worked ranches all over Colorado and Wyoming, took me with him after my mother passed." "You are better than most men I have seen," Martin said, and there was no resentment in his voice, only honest admiration. "That Mustang yesterday, that was something special." "The Mustang did most of the work," Hannah said. "I just helped him understand what I wanted." The other hand, an older man named Peters with a gray beard and quiet demeanor, nodded slowly. "Takes a certain kind of person to think like that," he said. "Most folks just see an animal as something to beat into submission." Hannah thought about the horses she had known, the cattle she had worked, the way her father had taught her to observe and listen before acting. "Animals are not that different from people," she said. "They respond better to respect than to fear." When they rode back to the ranch as the sun angled toward the western mountains, Hannah felt the first small threads of acceptance beginning to weave around her. The work was hard but familiar, and she had proven she could keep pace with anyone. That night, she was invited to eat with the hands at the bunkhouse, a long table under the cottonwood trees where the cook served beef stew and cornbread that soaked up the gravy like edible sponges. Xavier appeared as they were finishing the meal, walking among his men with the easy authority of someone who had earned his position rather than inherited it, even though Hannah knew the ranch had been his father's before him. He stopped by where she sat and asked how her first day had gone. "Good," Hannah said, aware that the entire table had gone quiet to listen. "South fence needs work in 3 places, and there is a wash that will cause problems if we get heavy rain." "Show Dutch on the map tomorrow," Xavier said. "We will get a crew out there before monsoon season." He paused, then added, "That Mustang you roped yesterday is gentling down nicely. I would like you to work with him if you are willing. See if you can get him saddle broke." Hannah felt every eye on her, understanding that this was a test and an opportunity combined. Breaking horses was skilled work, the kind that built reputations. "I would be glad to," she said. Over the following weeks, Hannah settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She worked the Mustang every morning before the heat became unbearable, teaching him to accept the saddle blanket, then the saddle itself, then finally the weight of a rider. The horse, whom she named Smoke for his gray, dappled coat, proved intelligent and willing once he understood that she meant him no harm. The other hand stopped to watch sometimes, leaning on the corral fence and offering commentary that gradually shifted from skeptical to impressed. Xavier watched too, though he tried to be less obvious about it. Hannah would catch glimpses of him at the ranch house window or standing in the shadow of the barn, his attention focused on her work with an intensity that made her hyper-aware of every movement she made. She told herself he was simply monitoring his investment, making sure his gamble on hiring her was paying off, but there was something in the way his gaze lingered that suggested more than professional interest. It was Dutch who finally said something, pulling her aside one evening after she had finished working with Smoke. The old foreman chewed his tobacco thoughtfully before speaking. "Boss has been different since you got here," he said without preamble. Hannah wiped sweat from her forehead with her bandana. "Different how?" she asked, though she had a suspicion she knew where this was going. "Happier," Dutch said. "More engaged with the work. He lost his wife 4 years back, childbirth that went bad, lost both her and the baby. Been going through the motions since then, doing what needed doing but without any real heart in it. You have reminded him that there are still things in the world worth paying attention to." The revelation struck Hannah harder than she expected. She had noticed that Xavier wore no ring, that there were no women's touches in the ranch house, but she had assumed he was simply unmarried by choice or circumstance. Learning that he was a widower, that he had lost not only his wife but his child, cast everything about him in a different light. The intensity she had interpreted as mere focus was perhaps a man learning to feel again after years of numbness. "I am sorry for his loss," Hannah said quietly. "That is a terrible thing to endure." "It was," Dutch agreed. "Worst I ever seen him, but life goes on whether we want it to or not. Just thought you should know, in case you've been wondering why he watches you the way he does." Hannah had been wondering exactly that, though she had tried not to think about it too much. Xavier O'Malley was her employer, a man of property and position, while she was a drifter with nothing to her name but a horse and the clothes in her pack. Whatever attraction she might feel, whatever moments of connection sparked between them when their eyes met across the corral, or when he came to check her work, it could not lead anywhere practical. She had finally found stable employment and a place to live, and she was not fool enough to risk that for romantic notions that would likely come to nothing. But knowing about his past made it harder to maintain her emotional distance. She found herself noticing small things about him. The way he always made sure the hands had enough water during the hot afternoon hours, how he worked alongside his men rather than simply giving orders, the careful maintenance he put into every building and fence line on his property. Xavier O'Malley was not a man who did things halfway, and there was something deeply appealing about that kind of dedication. July brought heat that shimmered off the rocks and turned the ground to powder. The cattle moved to higher pastures seeking relief, and the ranch work shifted to focus on maintaining water sources and preparing for the sales that would happen in the fall. Hannah rode out with crews to check on the herds, counting calves and marking any animals that needed medical attention. She proved herself skilled at roping sick cattle for treatment, able to cut a specific animal out of a moving herd with a precision that earned respect even from the most skeptical hands. It was during one of these rides that trouble found them. Hannah was working the northern range with Martin and Peters when they spotted riders approaching from the direction of the canyon. 3 men on dusty horses, wearing guns low on their hips, and the kind of hard expressions that spoke of violent intentions. Hannah felt her stomach tighten as they drew closer, and she moved her hand casually to rest near the rifle in her saddle scabbard. "That is Chet Walker," Peters said quietly, his voice carrying warning. "He runs a spread east of here, claims Xavier stole water rights that belong to him. Been bad blood between the 2 ranches for the past year." The riders stopped about 20 feet away, and the man in the center, presumably Chet Walker, fixed his attention on Hannah with an expression that made her skin crawl. He was perhaps 40, with a thick mustache and eyes like chips of flint. "O'Malley hiring women now," he said, loud enough for his companions to laugh. "Must be getting desperate." Hannah kept her face neutral and her voice level. "We are just checking cattle, mister. Do not want any trouble." "You are on disputed land," Walker said, which was a lie and they all knew it. The northern range had been part of the Outpost Ranch for 20 years. "I suggest you and your friends head back before somebody gets hurt." Martin started to say something, but Hannah caught his eye and shook her head slightly. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and getting into a confrontation out here would serve no purpose but satisfying Walker's desire for a fight. "We will let our boss know you have concerns about the boundary," she said carefully. "I am sure the 2 of you can discuss it like reasonable men." "I am done discussing," Walker said, his hand moving toward his gun. "Tell O'Malley his time is running out. This land is going to be mine, one way or another." Hannah gathered her reins, signaling for Martin and Peters to do the same. They turned their horses and rode away at a pace that was quick without being panicked. But every muscle in Hannah's body stayed tensed until they were well out of rifle range. When they finally slowed to let the horses breathe, Martin let out a string of curses that would have made a saloon girl blush. "That son of a bitch is going to start a war," he said, fear and anger mixing in his voice. "Xavier needs to know about this." They rode hard back to the ranch, and Hannah was the one who went to find Xavier. He was in the barn checking on a mare who was due to foal, and when Hannah explained what had happened, she watched his expression go from concern to coldly furious in the space of a heartbeat. "Did he threaten you directly?" Xavier asked, his voice tight with controlled rage. "He threatened all of us," Hannah said. "But mostly he seemed intent on delivering a message to you, said his time for discussing was over." Xavier removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration that Hannah had come to recognize. "Chet Walker has been trying to expand his territory for years," he said. "His ranch is failing because he treats his land and his animals like they are disposable. Now he wants what I have built instead of fixing his own problems." "What are you going to do?" Hannah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "I am going to ride into El Dorado Canyon tomorrow and speak with the sheriff," Xavier said. "Get it on record that Walker is making threats and encroaching on my land. I will not start a fight, but I will damn sure be prepared to finish one if he forces the issue." Hannah nodded, understanding the position Xavier was in. The law in Nevada territory was still developing, and while the sheriff might file a report, there was only so much he could do to prevent violence between neighboring ranches. Men like Chet Walker respected force more than legal documents, and if he was determined to take what he wanted, words would not stop him. "I want to come with you tomorrow," Hannah said, the decision forming as she spoke. "To town, I mean, as a witness to what happened today." Xavier looked at her for a long moment, and Hannah saw something shift in his expression, a war between wanting to protect her and recognizing that she had every right to be involved. "It could make things more complicated," he said finally. "Walker already noticed you today. If you give a statement to the sheriff, you will be putting yourself in his sights." "I am already in his sights," Hannah pointed out. "I work for you, which makes me part of this whether I want to be or not. Besides, 3 witnesses are better than 2. "You are right," Xavier admitted. "We ride out at first light. Tell Martin and Peters to be ready as well." That night, Hannah lay in her cabin bed and listened to the coyotes singing in the hills. She had known when she took this job that the West was still a violent place, that disputes over land and water often ended in bloodshed. But experiencing the threat firsthand was different from knowing about it in the abstract. Chet Walker had looked at her like she was an obstacle to be removed, and men like that did not hesitate when it came to violence. But she had also seen the way Xavier's hands had clenched into fists when she told him about the encounter, the protective fury that had flashed through his eyes. He was angry not just about the territorial dispute, but about the fact that his people, his employees, had been threatened. Hannah recognized that kind of loyalty because she had seen it in her father, and she found herself trusting Xavier O'Malley in a way she had not trusted anyone since her father died. The ride to El Dorado Canyon took 2 hours in the morning heat. The town itself was a collection of wooden buildings clinging to the rocky landscape where the Colorado River had carved its passage through the mountains. It had started as a mining camp and evolved into a supply hub for the surrounding ranches and the remaining prospectors who still believed they would strike it rich in these red rock hills. The sheriff's office sat on the main street between the general store and a saloon that advertised whiskey and card games in equal measure. Sheriff Tom Brennan was a tired-looking man in his 50s, who listened to their account with the weary expression of someone who had heard similar stories too many times. He wrote down their statements carefully, asked questions about exactly where the encounter had happened and what words had been exchanged, then leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I can file this report and ride out to have a conversation with Chet Walker," he said. "But we all know that is not going to solve anything. Walker is convinced those Northern Range water rights should be his, and he is not the kind to let go of a grudge. The deed is clear," Xavier said, frustration evident in his voice. "My father bought that land legally, filed all the proper paperwork. Walker has no legitimate claim." "I am not disputing that," the sheriff said, "but Walker is not interested in what's legal. He is interested in what he can take. You need to be careful, Xavier. Keep your men close and armed. If Walker makes a move, defend yourself, but try not to escalate if you can avoid it." It was the best they were going to get, and they all knew it. On the ride back to the ranch, Hannah could feel the tension radiating off Xavier like heat from sun-baked stone. She rode up alongside him, letting Martin and Peters fall back far enough to give them relative privacy. "You built something good at the Outpost Ranch," she said quietly. "That is worth defending." Xavier glanced at her, and some of the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "My father spent his whole life building this place," he said. "Left Ireland with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to make something of himself. I will not let a man like Chet Walker destroy that legacy." "You will not have to do it alone," Hannah said. "Your men are loyal. They will stand with you." "I know," Xavier said, then added, "You have become part of this place faster than anyone I have ever seen. The hands respect you, the work gets done better with you here, and you have a way with the horses that borders on magic. I am glad you stayed, Hannah. Glad you named your wage that first day." The way he said her name, with a softness that contrasted sharply with the hard edges of everything else they had been discussing, made Hannah's heart perform an acrobatic maneuver she had not authorized. She kept her eyes forward, watching the desert landscape roll past, and tried to ignore the warmth spreading through her chest. "I am glad I stayed too," she said, and meant it more than she had meant anything in a long time. The next weeks passed in a state of watchful tension. Xavier posted guards at night and made sure everyone on the ranch went armed at all times. Hannah continued her work with Smoke, who had progressed to accepting a rider and responding to basic commands, and she took on additional responsibilities breaking 2 more horses that Xavier had acquired from a trader passing through. The work was good, the kind that tired her body but satisfied her soul, and despite the threat hanging over the ranch, Hannah found herself more content than she had been since before her father's death. Xavier sought out her company more often, sometimes with legitimate ranch business to discuss, but increasingly just to talk. They would sit on the porch of the main house in the evening, watching the sun paint the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold, and conversation would flow between them with surprising ease. He told her about his childhood in Nevada, about learning the ranch business from his father, while his mother tried to instill Irish traditions and Catholic values in a land that seemed determined to strip away anything soft or sentimental. She told him about following her father from ranch to ranch, about learning to read by lamplight in bunkhouses and lined shacks, about the way her father's cough had worsened gradually, until it became the thing that defined their days. "He made me promise I would not try to keep the homestead," Hannah said one evening, the words coming easier than she expected. "Said it was no life for a woman alone, that I should sell it and use the money to start somewhere new. But there was nothing to sell. The land was played out and we owed more than it was worth, so I packed what I could carry and started riding. That took courage, Xavier said. Most people would have given up or tried to find an easier path. There is no easier path, Hannah said simply. Not for people like me. I have to make my own way, and that means doing whatever work I can do well. You do this work better than well, Xavier said, and the intensity in his voice made her turn to look at him. You do it better than most men I have known, and you do it with a grace that makes it look effortless, even though I know it is not. Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the residual warmth of the day. You are kind to say so, she managed. I am not being kind, Xavier said, holding her gaze. I am being honest. You have become essential to this ranch in the short time you have been here, but more than that, you have become essential to me. I find myself looking for you during the day, wondering what you are doing, wanting to hear your thoughts on things that have nothing to do with cattle or horses. Hannah, I think you must know that my feelings for you have grown beyond those of an employer. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and precious and terrifying. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed what Xavier had just said, what he was offering. She had felt the connection growing between them, but had convinced herself it was one-sided, that a man like him would never seriously consider a woman like her. But the vulnerability in his eyes, the way his hand trembled slightly where it rested on the porch railing, told her this was not a casual flirtation or a momentary attraction. I have thought about you too, Hannah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. More than is probably wise, considering you are my employer and I am dependent on this job. But I cannot seem to help it. You are the finest man I have met, Xavier O'Malley, and not because of this ranch or your name, but because of who you are in your heart. Xavier reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. Then we are agreed, he said. This thing between us is real and worth exploring, consequences be damned. Hannah felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into water of unknown depth. But Xavier's hand in hers felt like an anchor and a promise combined, and she decided that some risks were worth taking. Agreed, she said, and smiled when his face lit up with uncomplicated joy. They courted in the stolen moments between work, in the early mornings when Hannah would find coffee already made in the ranch house kitchen, and Xavier waiting to share it with her, in the evenings when they would walk down to the creek and talk until the stars came out. He was respectful of her reputation and her independence, never pushing for more than she was comfortable giving, but the affection between them grew like grass after rain, quick and green and impossible to hide. The ranch hands noticed, of course. Men who spent their days together developed a keen sense for changes in the social dynamics, and Xavier's obvious devotion to Hannah was about as subtle as a lightning strike. But the response was largely positive. The men liked Hannah and respected Xavier, and most of them seemed to think it was about time their boss found some happiness after years of grieving solitude. It was Dutch who gave them his blessing, pulling Xavier aside one day in August and saying, "That Zimmerman girl is good people. You could do a lot worse, and frankly, I do not think you could do much better. Your daddy would have approved." Xavier valued Dutch's opinion more than almost anyone's, and hearing that endorsement solidified what he already knew in his heart. He wanted Hannah Zimmerman in his life permanently, not just as an employee but as a partner in every sense of the word. But before he could figure out how to properly propose to a woman who might well tell him she was not interested in being tied down to one place or one man, Chet Walker made his move. It happened on a moonless night in late August when visibility was poor, and the guards were tired from a long day of moving cattle. Walker and 6 of his men rode onto Outpost Ranch land with torches and bad intentions, setting fire to a storage barn on the eastern edge of the property before most people even realized they were there. By the time the alarm was raised and men came running with buckets, the barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching toward the black sky like grasping fingers. Hannah heard the shouts from her cabin and was out the door with her rifle in seconds, not bothering with anything more than the pants and shirt she had been sleeping in. She ran toward the flames, joining the bucket line that was trying desperately to keep the fire from spreading to nearby structures. The heat was intense, singeing her eyebrows and making her eyes stream with tears, but she kept working, passing buckets until her arms burned with fatigue. Xavier was everywhere at once, directing efforts, making sure everyone stayed safe, organizing a crew to wet down the buildings closest to the fire. His face was black with soot, and his voice was hoarse from shouting, but he kept moving, kept everyone focused on containment rather than futile attempts to save the barn itself. It took 3 hours to get the fire under control, and by then the barn was nothing but a skeleton of charred timber and ash. They lost equipment stored inside and a winter's worth of hay, but no people and no animals, which Xavier declared a victory even as he stood looking at the destruction with exhausted fury in his eyes. It was Walker, Dutch said, approaching with 2 of the night guards. Miller here saw riders heading east right after the fire started, 6 or 7 of them, moving fast. Xavier's jaw clenched so hard Hannah could see the muscles jump beneath his soot-stained skin. "Get everyone together," he said quietly, the kind of quiet that was more dangerous than shouting. "I want every hand armed and ready to ride at first light. We are going to end this." "Xavier, no," Hannah said, stepping in front of him. "That is exactly what he wants. If you ride onto his property with armed men, he can claim self-defense for whatever happens. You will be playing into his hands." "I cannot just let him burn my property and threaten my people," Xavier said, but she could hear the conflict in his voice, the war between rage and reason. "You will not," Hannah said firmly. "We are going to ride to El Dorado Canyon at first light, all of us, and we are going to make sure the sheriff sees this damage and hears from witnesses who saw Walker's men. Then you are going to file charges and let the law handle it." "The law has not done much good so far," Xavier pointed out bitterly. "The law has not had this much evidence before," Hannah countered. "Threatening us on open range is one thing. Arson with witnesses is another. Give the sheriff a chance to do his job before you start a war that will get people killed." Xavier looked at her for a long moment, and Hannah held his gaze, willing him to see reason, to choose the path that would not lead to bloodshed and potential destruction of everything he had built. Finally, he nodded slowly. "First light," he said. "But Hannah, if the law cannot or will not act, I will do what I have to do to protect this ranch." "I know," Hannah said, "and I will stand with you when that time comes, but let us try this first." The ride to El Dorado Canyon the next morning was tense and silent. A dozen armed men and one woman bringing evidence of a crime to a lawman who might or might not be able to help them. Sheriff Brennan took one look at their soot-stained clothes and grim faces, and ushered them into his office with the weariness of a man who had known this day was coming. Hannah told him about the fire, about the guards who had seen riders fleeing east, about the systematic escalation of Walker's threats and actions. Xavier provided documentation of the property damage, the lost hay and equipment, the cost in dollars and safety. Martin and Peters corroborated everything, and by the time they were finished, even Sheriff Brennan's tired cynicism had been replaced with genuine anger. "This crosses a line," he said. "Arson is a serious crime, and with witnesses placing Walker's men at the scene, I have grounds to arrest him. But you need to understand, Xavier, that an arrest is just the beginning. This will go to trial, assuming I can take Walker without gunfire, and trials can take months. In the meantime, you need to keep your people safe. I will hire additional guards, Xavier said. Post them around the clock. Whatever it takes. Sheriff Brennan nodded and reached for his hat. I am going to get a deputy and ride out to Walker's place now while he is hopefully not expecting it. You folks go home and stay alert. I will send word when I have news. The waiting was harder than the work. Hannah threw herself into the daily tasks of the ranch with almost desperate energy, trying not to think about what might be happening at Chet Walker's ranch, or what might happen if the sheriff's attempt to arrest him went wrong. Xavier was wound tight as a barbed wire fence, snapping at small problems and apologizing immediately after, his stress manifesting in short temper and restless movement. It was late afternoon when the sheriff's deputy rode up to the ranch with news. Sheriff Brennan had arrested Chet Walker without incident, catching him and 3 of his men at their ranch and hauling them to the jail in El Dorado Canyon. The trial was set for 6 weeks out, when the circuit judge would be passing through, and in the meantime, Walker and his men would remain in custody. The deputy also reported that Walker's remaining hands had scattered, some heading to other territories and others simply disappearing into the backcountry. The relief that swept through the Outpost Ranch was almost physical. Xavier actually smiled for the first time in days, and the hands celebrated with an extra ration of whiskey that Dutch produced from some hidden supply. Hannah found herself pulled into a spontaneous hug by Martin, who spun her around like a rag doll, before setting her down with an embarrassed apology that she waved off with a laugh. That evening, Xavier asked Hannah to ride out with him to a spot overlooking the canyon, where the last rays of the sun were painting the landscape in impossible colors. They sat on a flat rock together, shoulders touching, and watched the day surrender to night. "You saved this ranch," Xavier said quietly. "If you had not stopped me from riding out in anger, I would have given Walker exactly what he wanted, a confrontation that would have destroyed us both. You have wisdom beyond your years, Hannah Zimmerman. I just did not want to see you throw away everything over a man like Chet Walker," Hannah said. "He is not worth it." "No, he is not," Xavier agreed. "But you are." He shifted to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Hannah, I know we have not been courting long by conventional standards, but I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You are strong and smart and brave, and you understand this life in a way most people never will. I want you in my life, not just as an employee or even as someone I am courting, but as my wife. If you will have me." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She had known their relationship was heading toward something permanent, but hearing the actual proposal still made her head spin. Marriage meant security, a home, a future that extended beyond the next paycheck or the next ranch. But more than that, it meant sharing her life with a man she had come to love truly and deeply, in a way she had not believed possible. "I will have you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I will absolutely have you, Xavier O'Malley." "Yes." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. Hannah kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and affection she had been holding inside, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "I do not have a ring yet," Xavier said apologetically. "I should have planned this better." "I do not need a ring right now," Hannah said. "I just need you to kiss me again." He obliged happily, and they stayed on that rock overlooking the canyon until the stars came out in full force, talking about the future they would build together. Xavier wanted to expand the ranch, improve the breeding stock, maybe buy the adjacent property if it ever came up for sale. Hannah wanted to start a proper horse training program, building on the reputation she was developing for gentling difficult animals. They talked about children, both of them wanting a family eventually, and about building a life that honored the past while reaching toward the future. When they finally rode back to the ranch, hand in hand despite the awkwardness of managing reins that way, Dutch took one look at their faces and announced to the bunkhouse that there was going to be a wedding. The hands cheered and offered congratulations, and Hannah felt the warmth of acceptance and belonging settle over her like a comfortable coat. The trial of Chet Walker took place on a crisp October morning, with half the territory seemingly in attendance to watch. The circuit judge was an older man with no tolerance for nonsense, and he listened to the evidence with sharp attention. Hannah testified about the encounters with Walker's men, about the threats and the night of the fire. The guards who had seen the riders testified. Xavier presented documentation of the damages. Walker's lawyer, a nervous man from Carson City, tried to create reasonable doubt but could not overcome the weight of the testimony against his client. The judge found Chet Walker and his 3 men guilty of arson and conspiracy, sentencing them to 5 years in the territorial prison, and ordering Walker to pay restitution to Xavier for the damages. As the bailiff led Walker out of the courtroom, the man turned to glare at Xavier and Hannah with such venom that Hannah felt a chill run down her spine. But then he was gone, removed from their lives by the bars of a prison cell, and the threat that had hung over the Outpost Ranch for months finally lifted. Xavier and Hannah were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in El Dorado Canyon, with Dutch serving as best man and Martin giving Hannah away in lieu of the father she had lost. She wore a dress borrowed from the general store owner's wife, cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar that made her feel more feminine than she had felt in years. Xavier wore his Sunday suit and looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he had never dared to speak. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony in the small white church that served El Dorado Canyon's spiritual needs, and when Xavier kissed his bride, the gathered witnesses cheered. The celebration afterward took place at the ranch, with food contributed by every family in the area and dancing that lasted until the moon rode high. Hannah danced with her new husband, with Dutch, with every hand on the ranch who asked, and she felt happiness bubble through her like spring water, pure and sweet. Xavier carried her over the threshold of the ranch house, which was now her house too, and they spent their wedding night learning the contours of each other's bodies with tenderness and passion. Hannah had never been with a man before, and Xavier was patient and careful, making sure her first experience was filled with pleasure rather than pain. They made love twice that night, and Hannah fell asleep in her husband's arms feeling like she had finally found the home she had been searching for since her father died. Life, as Mrs. Hannah O'Malley, took some adjustment, but not as much as she had feared. She kept working the ranch, though Xavier insisted she take on less of the dangerous jobs now that she was his wife. She continued training horses, developing a reputation that spread beyond El Dorado Canyon and brought buyers from as far away as California. Xavier expanded the ranch operations just as he had planned, buying better breeding stock and improving the water systems that fed the pastures. They were happy in a way that felt almost indecent, like they were getting away with something the universe had not intended to allow. Xavier would catch Hannah in the barn and kiss her until she was breathless, not caring if the hands saw. Hannah would leave notes in Xavier's saddlebags when he rode out to check the far pastures, little messages of affection that made him smile all day. They talked about everything and nothing, building a partnership that went beyond the romantic into true friendship and respect. In the spring of 1884, Hannah discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, through missed cycles and morning nausea that she initially attributed to bad beef. But when the symptoms persisted and her body began to change in unmistakable ways, she rode into El Dorado Canyon to see the doctor, who confirmed what she already suspected. Xavier's reaction when she told him was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then set her down gently as if suddenly remembering she was carrying something precious. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder and joy mixing in his voice. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Hannah asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not begin to cover what I am feeling," Xavier said, pulling her close. "Terrified, ecstatic, grateful, blessed. Hannah, you have given me back my life, and now you are giving me a family. I love you more than I have words to express." The pregnancy was not easy. Hannah was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down and exhausted all the time. Xavier fussed over her like a mother hen, trying to make her rest when all she wanted was to keep working. They compromised, with Hannah taking on lighter duties and agreeing to nap in the afternoons when the heat was worst. As her belly grew and her center of gravity shifted, she had to give up riding horses, which frustrated her more than anything, but she found other ways to be useful. The baby came on a cold January night in 1885. After 12 hours of labor that left Hannah sweating and swearing and vowing she would never do this again. But when the midwife placed her son in her arms, a red-faced, squalling bundle of life, all the pain evaporated in the face of overwhelming love. Xavier cried when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he marveled at the tiny fingers and the miniature features. They named him Thomas, after Xavier's father, and he became the center of their world. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor with a colicky baby at 2 in the morning without complaint. Hannah recovered from the birth and gradually returned to her work with the horses, bringing Thomas with her in a basket where she could keep an eye on him while she worked. The ranch continued to prosper. Xavier's reputation for quality cattle spread, and buyers came from all over to purchase Outpost Ranch stock. Hannah's horse training program grew, and she took on an apprentice, a young woman named Sarah who reminded Hannah of herself at that age, hungry to learn and unafraid of hard work. Watching Sarah develop her skills filled Hannah with pride and a sense of legacy. The knowledge that she was passing on what her father had taught her. Thomas grew from infant to toddler, a bright-eyed boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn determination. He was walking by 10 months and talking in full sentences by 2, a whirlwind of energy that kept both his parents on their toes. Xavier taught him to ride as soon as he was big enough to stay on a horse, and Thomas took to it with natural grace that made Hannah's heart swell with pride. When Thomas was 3, Hannah discovered she was pregnant again. This time the symptoms were easier, or perhaps she was just more prepared for them, and she continued working through most of the pregnancy without too much disruption. Xavier worried, of course, but he had learned to trust Hannah's judgment about what she could and could not handle. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1888, arriving so quickly that the midwife barely made it in time. Hannah named her Grace, after her own mother whom she had never known, and from the moment she opened her gray-green eyes, Grace O'Malley had her father completely wrapped around her tiny fingers. Where Thomas was wild energy, Grace was quiet observation, watching the world with solemn attention before breaking into smiles that could melt the hardest heart. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family, seasons passing with the reliable cycle of ranch work and child rearing. Thomas started school in El Dorado Canyon, riding in with one of the hands every morning, and coming home full of stories about his lessons and his friends. Grace followed in her brother's shadow, adoring him with uncomplicated devotion that sometimes annoyed him, and sometimes made him fiercely protective. In 1892, when Thomas was 7 and Grace was 4, Xavier surprised Hannah by taking her to Carson City for a week, leaving the children with Dutch and his wife. They stayed in a hotel with indoor plumbing and electric lights, luxuries that made Hannah feel like she was visiting a different world. Xavier took her to restaurants and a theatrical performance, bought her dresses, and a hat with feathers that she would never wear on the ranch but loved anyway. They made love in a proper bed with clean sheets every night, and Hannah felt like she was courting again, getting to know her husband outside the context of work and children. "I wanted you to know that I see you," Xavier said one evening as they sat in the hotel dining room. "Not just as the mother of my children or the best horse trainer in Nevada, but as the woman I fell in love with. Hannah, you are remarkable, and I never want you to feel taken for granted." "I do not," Hannah assured him, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You make me feel valued every day, Xavier. This trip is wonderful, but so is our everyday life. I love what we have built together." "So do I," Xavier said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew it." They returned home to find the ranch running smoothly under Dutch's supervision, and their children healthy and happy, though clearly glad to have their parents back. Life resumed its normal patterns, but Hannah carried the memory of that week like a precious stone in her pocket, proof that romance did not have to end just because life got busy and complicated. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge. Thomas grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, learning the business from the ground up and showing natural leadership skills that made Xavier proud. Grace developed a gift for gentling horses that rivaled her mother's, and by the time she was 12, she was working alongside Hannah training colts and fillies that sold for premium prices. In 1897, when the children were nearly grown and Hannah was approaching 40, Xavier came to her with a proposition. "I want to build you a proper training facility," he said. "A barn specifically designed for working with horses, with covered arenas for when the weather is bad and everything laid out the way you need it. The Outpost Ranch horse program has become famous enough to warrant its own space." Hannah was overwhelmed by the gesture, by the recognition of her contribution to the ranch's success and Xavier's continued support of her work. "That would be incredible," she said, "but it will be expensive." "We can afford it," Xavier said, "and Hannah, you have earned it 100 times over. This ranch is what it is because of both of us, and I want that reflected in how we structure things going forward." The training barn was completed in the spring of 1898, a beautiful structure with high ceilings and excellent ventilation, everything Hannah had ever dreamed of having. She moved her operation into the new space and immediately saw improvements in her efficiency and the quality of her work. Buyers came from even farther away, and Hannah hired 2 more apprentices to help meet the demand. Thomas turned 18 that year and took on more responsibility at the ranch, proving himself as capable as his father. Grace, at 16, was already fielding marriage proposals from young men in the territory, but she showed no interest in settling down yet, preferring to focus on her work with the horses. Hannah and Xavier watched their children become adults with the bittersweet knowledge that the years were passing faster than they wanted. One evening in the summer of 1899, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the canyon walls, Xavier turned to Hannah and said, "Do you remember that first day, when you roped that Mustang and I asked you to name your wage?" "Of course," Hannah said. "That was the day that changed everything." "I did not know it then," Xavier said, "but that was the luckiest day of my life. You could have asked for any amount and I would have paid it to keep you here. But what I got was worth so much more than money. I got you and everything that came with you. A partner, a wife, a family, a future I had stopped believing I could have. You saved me, Hannah, in every way a person can be saved." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. "You saved me too," she said. "I was drifting when I came here, just trying to survive from one day to the next. You gave me a home, a purpose, love that I had given up hoping for. We saved each other, Xavier." He pulled her close, and they sat together as the stars began to emerge, comfortable in the silence that came from 20 years of knowing each other completely. The ranch spread out below them, everything they had built through hard work and determination and love. Their children were healthy and happy, pursuing their own paths while remaining rooted in the land that had shaped them. The future stretched ahead with all its unknown possibilities, but Hannah faced it without fear because she knew whatever came, she and Xavier would face it together. As the new century dawned in 1900, the Outpost Ranch stood as a testament to what two people could accomplish when they combined their strengths and committed to a shared vision. Hannah was recognized throughout Nevada and beyond as one of the finest horse trainers in the West, and Xavier's cattle operation was known for quality and fair dealing. Together, they had created something that would last beyond their own lives, a legacy for their children and the generations that would follow. On a warm spring day in 1901, Thomas married a local girl named Elizabeth, and they moved into the foreman's house that Dutch had vacated upon his retirement the year before. Dutch himself had moved to town with his wife, enjoying a well-earned rest after 40 years of ranch work. But he visited often and always had advice for Thomas as he learned to manage his own crew of hands. Grace continued to resist marriage, declaring that she was perfectly happy working with horses and had no interest in becoming someone's wife just yet. Hannah understood completely, remembering her own younger self who had valued independence above security. Xavier worried about his daughter remaining unmarried, but Hannah reminded him that Grace was only 19 and had plenty of time to figure out what she wanted from life. In the fall of that year, Hannah stood in her training barn watching Grace work with a difficult mare, using all the techniques Hannah had taught her and adding innovations of her own. Hannah felt a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that the knowledge her father had passed to her was now living on in her daughter, who would pass it to her own children someday. The chain remained unbroken, stretching from past to future, connecting generations through shared wisdom and love of the work. Xavier came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist in the easy familiarity of long marriage. "She is incredible," he said, nodding toward Grace. "Just like her mother." "She is better than I was at her age," Hannah said honestly. "She has more formal training and better facilities. She will go farther than I ever could." "But she only got here because of you," Xavier pointed out. "Everything good in my life has come from you, Hannah. You are the center around which everything else orbits." Hannah leaned into him, grateful for his solid presence and his unwavering love. "We orbit each other," she corrected gently. "That is what partnership means." They stood together watching their daughter work, and Hannah reflected on the strange and wonderful path her life had taken. She had arrived at the Outpost Ranch with nothing but her skills and her determination, a woman alone in a world that had little place for such women. Xavier had seen her value immediately and given her the opportunity to prove herself. and in doing so, he had given her everything she had never known she needed. The rope had sung through the air that June day in 1883, landing true and setting in motion a chain of events that had brought her here, to this moment, to this life that exceeded any dream she might have dreamed. She had been able to rope better than any man on his ranch, and the cowboy had said, "Name your wage and stay." She had named her price, and he had met it, and in the end they had both gained far more than either of them had bargained for. As the sun set over the Nevada landscape and Grace finally brought the mare under control, Hannah turned to Xavier and kissed him, there in the barn with hay dust floating through the golden light. He kissed her back with the same passion he had shown on their wedding night nearly 2 decades earlier, and Hannah knew with absolute certainty that she would choose this life, this man, this place, again and again if given the chance. The years that followed brought their share of challenges and changes. Thomas and Elizabeth welcomed 3 children in quick succession, filling the ranch with the sounds of young voices and laughter. Grace eventually did marry in 1905 to a horse buyer from California who understood her passion for her work and supported her continuing it even after the wedding. They built a house on Outpost Ranch land and went into business together, expanding Hannah's training program into something even larger and more successful. Xavier's hair went gray, and Hannah's hands developed the kind of arthritis that came from decades of hard physical work, but they remained active and engaged with the ranch operations. They mentored Thomas as he gradually took over the day-to-day management, offering advice when asked, but trusting him to make his own decisions and learn from his own mistakes. In 1910, on a summer evening very like the one when Xavier had proposed, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a party that drew people from all over the territory. Hannah wore a green dress that matched her eyes, and Xavier danced with her under the stars while their children and grandchildren looked on. Later, when the guests had departed and they were alone on the porch of the house they had shared for so long, Xavier took her hand and said, "If I had known that day in 1883 that hiring you would lead to all of this, I still would not have believed anyone who told me." "You exceed my wildest dreams, Hannah O'Malley." "And you exceed mine," Hannah replied. "Every single day you exceed them." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over the canyon, and Hannah thought about the mustang she had roped all those years ago, the skillful throw that had changed everything. Her father had taught her well, giving her the tools she needed to survive in a harsh world, but it was Xavier who had given her the space to thrive. Together, they had built a life that honored the past while reaching boldly toward the future. And as Hannah rested her head on her husband's shoulder, she felt the deep contentment of someone who had found exactly where they belonged. The Outpost Ranch continued to flourish under the combined efforts of the O'Malley family, a testament to the power of hard work, determination, and love. Hannah's training methods became legendary, written about in Western journals and studied by ranchers throughout the region. Xavier's cattle operation expanded to neighboring states, and the Outpost Ranch brand became synonymous with quality and integrity. But for Hannah, the greatest success was not measured in acres or dollars or reputation. It was measured in the laughter of grandchildren playing in the yard, in the pride she felt watching Grace work with the same patience and skill Hannah had learned from her own father, in the quiet evenings spent with Xavier talking about their day or simply sitting in companionable silence. She had been a drifter once, a woman with no home and an uncertain future. Now she was the matriarch of a family, the heart of a successful enterprise, and the beloved wife of a man who valued her as an equal partner in all things. As the years advanced, and Hannah and Xavier moved into what people called their golden years, they never lost the essential connection that had drawn them together. Xavier still looked at Hannah like she was the most remarkable woman he had ever met, and Hannah still felt her heart skip when Xavier walked into a room. Their love had deepened and matured, but it had never dulled, and everyone who knew them recognized that they had something rare and precious. In the spring of 1920, when Hannah was 60 and Xavier was 69, they took a trip back to the site where the old storage barn had stood, the one that Chet Walker had burned down nearly 4 decades earlier. Nothing remained of the structure itself, but wildflowers had claimed the space, turning the scar into something beautiful. They stood hand in hand, remembering the fear and anger of that time, grateful that they had chosen the path of law over vengeance, wisdom over rage. "You were right to stop me from riding out that day," Xavier said. "If I had listened to my anger instead of your wisdom, we might have lost everything. I might have lost you." "You would never have lost me," Hannah said firmly. "I would have followed you into whatever trouble you found. But I am glad we found a better way." They walked back to the ranch house together, moving slower than they once had but still strong and capable. The ranch spread out around them, 3 generations of O'Malleys working the land and caring for the animals, carrying on the legacy that Hannah and Xavier had built through decades of partnership. It was more than either of them had dreamed of that first day when Hannah had roped the Mustang and Xavier had recognized her worth. That evening, surrounded by their children and grandchildren at the dinner table, Xavier raised his glass in a toast. "To Hannah," he said, "who could rope better than any man on my ranch, and who gave me everything I never knew I needed when she agreed to stay. You are the best decision I ever made, and I thank God every day that you rode into my life." Hannah felt tears on her cheeks as she raised her own glass. "To Xavier," she responded, "who saw me for who I truly was and gave me the chance to prove myself. You are the finest man I have ever known, and loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." The family cheered and drank, and the evening dissolved into the warm chaos of a large, happy family sharing a meal. Hannah looked around the table at the faces she loved, at the life she had built through courage and skill and Xavier's willingness to take a chance on an unknown woman who had appeared in his corral with a rope and a dream, and she felt utterly complete. The sunset painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson as the O'Malley family finished their dinner, and Hannah knew that when the darkness came, she would go to bed beside the man she loved, in the house they had made a home, on the land they had defended and nurtured together. She would wake in the morning to the work she loved, surrounded by the family she had created, living the life she had earned through determination and grace. She had named her wage and stayed, and in return, she had received riches beyond measure. Not in gold or silver, but in love and partnership, and the satisfaction of building something that would outlast them both. The Outpost Ranch would continue long after Hannah and Xavier were gone, and their great-grandchildren would tell stories about the woman who could rope better than any man, and the cowboy who had been wise enough to recognize her worth. It was a legacy written not in words but in the land itself, in the horses that ran in the pastures and the cattle that bore the Outpost brand, in the training methods that would be passed down through generations, and most of all, in the example of a love that had transformed 2 individual lives into something far greater than the sum of their parts. As the stars emerged over the Nevada desert, and the family finally dispersed to their various homes, Xavier and Hannah sat together on the porch one last time, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest. They did not need words anymore, having said everything that mattered in countless ways over nearly 4 decades together. They simply existed in the moment, grateful for every sunrise they had shared and every sunset still to come. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a love that would echo through time, as enduring as the red rock canyons and as constant as the stars wheeling overhead in the vast western sky.